Greetings to the ACH Massive, colleagues, the wider community, the UWI and academic community, and our audience on YouTube who have joined us for the final panel of the day entitled Contested Indigeneity and Sovereignty in Post-Colonial Jamaica. A pleasant good evening to all of you. I am Candia Mitchell Hall, a lecturer of Caribbean Civilization and Materiality at the UWI Mona campus, and I'm delighted to chair this virtual panel on such an important topic that has captured the imagination of the public and intellectuals at large on questions of indigeneity and sovereignty in the Caribbean. So there is something redemptive about this panel in the ways it returns to and regenerates the indigenous identities and ancestral spaces and sovereignties at large, and how it unsettles narratives of coloniality in the Caribbean. So with no further ado, I want to welcome our esteemed panel of presenters. Our first presenter, Dr. Erica Nigana-Widjin, is a faculty member at the Western University and Director of Indigenous Education. I will go on into a more lengthy bio data before her presentation, as well as the presentation of the other presenters. We have Dr. Mario Nisbet, a lecturer at the University of Cape Coast, Ghana, and Dr. Leslie Gale Atkinson Swaby, a lecturer at the Edna Manley College of Visual and Performing Arts. So for today, audience, we just want to thank you again. In terms of the presentations, we will have, of course, your contribution at the end, where you can contribute a question or a comment or some line of thought that you may have, but we ask everyone to abide by the norms of professional courtesy and etiquette during the session. We want to thank you again for joining us for such a significant and current, urgent conversation as well within this post-colonial Jamaican space. So I want to introduce the first presenter, Dr. Erica Nigana-Widjin, who will present on Taino peoples, contemporary voices, and self-determination. Dr. Nigana-Widjin is a faculty member, as I mentioned, at the Western University, and she has a Master's of Arts and a PhD. Her areas of teaching and research include Indigenous knowledge systems, intellectual traditions, Indigenous epistemologies, Indigenous history, and educational policies in North American contexts and Indigenous research methodologies. Dr. Nigana-Widjin, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that lovely introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you for that nod. Okay, so Mabrika, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for the chance to share with you today. I will begin this presentation by acknowledging the lands that I'm currently on and the peoples whose traditional territory I live on. I do this recognition to honor and remember Indigenous peoples, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinook peoples in this region. I also want to send my acknowledgement and a special recognition to the Yukayeke Yameya Guani, Jamaican Hummingbird Taino people, and the Maroon peoples and communities there. The focus of my presentation today is on Taino peoples' contemporary voices and self-determination. Self-determination in the context of this presentation means the right to exist and to preserve, learn, and continue engaging with our culture. I would also like to note that my research was funded by a grant from Athabasca University in Alberta, Canada, where I once worked. It enabled me to carry out this work, so I'd just like to acknowledge them for that support. The presentation looks at the resurgence movement of Taino people. It looks at how Taino people are regenerating ancestral knowledge and legacies as a way of remembering. And an examination of the historical records shows that Jamaica was one of the most well-populated islands with Taino people. And one question I get asked a lot is, are there Taino people in Jamaica? And of course, my response is yes. And I too am interested in these generational stories. So looking at it from a historical account, Ober describes Jamaica as a very populous island, adding further that Jamaica was one of the best peopled of all the Antilles. Other authors as well, such as De Worden, tells us that all historians, whether it's Bernaldez, Fernando Colombo, or Peter Martyr, they reported Jamaica to have been very well populated with indigenous people in 1494. Columbus' first landfall of Jamaica and his first voyage around the north side of the island, he was visited from many different villages by canoes of Taino people. So lots of Taino people from all over the island. And Finnerman remarks that Taino people had a strong political and social life. They had strong social structures in place. They had their own educational systems in place and so on. From my observation, one aspect, though, that these authors have in common is that they all speak of the sudden death of indigenous people of Jamaica. So I came to this research with an understanding that there really needs to be this collective approach to acquiring further knowledge about Taino people. When I did this research, it was a collective effort with people from one community in the southwest part of the island. Because, it's often challenging to find people who are willing to speak about being Taino. And it can especially be difficult within a Jamaican context because contemporary Jamaican Taino voices are often contested, exactly the theme of this panel today. So after all, Fort McMillan states that Taino is dead and they must remain dead. Gonzalez reminds us that 25 years ago, Caribbean people who claimed indigenous descent and who even dared to identify and organize as Taino peoples, they were commonly met with suspicion, they were often ridiculed, if not pathologized and dismissed. And I think that remains true for today. But I also see that this is changing. What you have today is this resurgence happening. And we see that Taino people historically were not just passive actors. In looking at the time of contact in Jamaica, Henry and Woodard, they write about the ancestral Taino place and site at Sellville in St. Anne's. And they examine how Taino people were impacted by contact, but also Taino people's resilience, that Taino people, they left their communities as part of their survivance and their survival. The authors also note that in a very short time, the villagers showed a resistance to those that were imposing on them. So I think that these earlier Taino communities displayed expressions of their self-determination, which connects with today's movement of Taino re-emergence on the island. And oftentimes we hear things like, we're still here. I wanted to show them that I wasn't extinct, or we sometimes hear, well, they're thought to be extinct. When you hear these words, you might believe this is in reference to Taino people, but it also relates to other indigenous people in many different regions of the world. For example, the Bothok people in Newfoundland, Canada, were thought to be extinct. Recent research by Steve Carr, who's a professor at Memorial University, came up with his research showed that they're not extinct, that they're related to contemporary indigenous people, and the nearby Mi'kmaq community, indigenous community, also carry these stories of the Bothok survival and the fact that they're not extinct. The Bothok, like Taino people, are also first contact people. And the Mi'kmaq people, the indigenous people, they already knew. Carr's research reinforced what they already knew because they carry these generational stories. Their communities, they carry those stories. You also have indigenous people in Uruguay, and they're asserting their existence. They're looking to be recognized as indigenous people in South America. And a quick browsing through the literature shows that Uruguay is one of the only countries in South America without indigenous people. And of course, when you hear those things, you really have to challenge it. I certainly do. And the erasure of indigenous people, no matter where they are geographically, is very much systemic and it's deliberate. You also have in Canadian context, you have the Sinai-Kista First Nations in Canada, and they were declared as no longer existing by the Canadian government through their Indian Act in 1956. The Sinai-Kista First Nations were gradually pushed off their territory. They kind of bordered the American border. And as you know, we have to be critical too about borders because they're man-made, they're entrenched, they're colonial. In any case, they were pushed off their territory. They were declared non-extinct, which means that if they're non-extinct in Canada, they have no Canadian rights as First Peoples in Canada. So they went to the court and proved otherwise. But I'm just trying to share with you these examples to show the commonalities with Taino people in the Caribbean, particularly in a Jamaican context. Some authors have described this dominant fatal impact model, the sudden devastation of Taino people that we've all heard about. The understanding of Taino people's right to exist then goes unchallenged because we've been hearing this our whole lives that they no longer exist. Recent research shows that Taino people used historically and developed strategies and approaches in defiance of the conditions which were imposed upon them. Today, you have archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, community scholars, community members working together to bring these stories to life. Again, though, Fort tells us that these assumptions of extinction makes any claim to indigeneity questioned and often challenged. And Fort also argues that recognizing the existence of indigenous peoples of the Caribbean contradict these long-held beliefs. Another aspect that I've observed is when you mention 1492, it is often detached from the Taino people. It is often detached from the Caribbean and from the concept of indigeneity. So there's hardly any mention of Taino people, and Taino people are working today to change that. So in Centering Taino Voices, I'd like to share with you a few insights from people who I connected with during my research who shared that they're Taino or have close connection to people who identify as Taino. So the first person I'd like to share some of their voice with you is Lorraine, and this is a pseudonym. Lorraine, who identifies as Taino, shared her thoughts on Taino knowledge systems. We are true Jamaican. How far is our bloodline coming from? They say we disappear, but they do not want to acknowledge us. Taino has a wealth of knowledge, including the lignum vitae called the tree of life. It is our national flower, so we know and we honor it. We have the cotton tree for the canoes. Nobody could survive in the Caribbean without Taino. This is Taino land and Taino knowledge. If people want to wake up, we must get back Taino knowledge, and we must make people who use our knowledge give back. Taino knowledge, it is as important as a credit card today. The objects that make us who we are, that was our survival, and it is as important as the phone in your hand. Nobody could survive without Taino. Nobody would know what plants to use. It is Taino who teaches them to live. If you have this bloodline, Wake Up Foundation, wake up. The objects we think are not great help our people to survive. The lignum vitae tree, my grandma, drink it for medicinal purposes. Every part of the lignum vitae is medicine. This is Taino country. If you don't recognize a Taino bloodline, don't use the medicine. So Lorraine has identified key Taino knowledge systems and related to Taino people's existence. So their erasure doesn't really reflect their reality and their everyday contemporary experiences. For example, our cacique, Kalan, had an investiture approximately 3 years ago and was chosen to be cacique or chief for the Yukayeke Yameyaguani, or the Jamaican hummingbird Taino people. And this is one example. It's all part of Taino people's right to exist. It is an example of a remarkable form of resurgence and indigenous self-determination in action. So today, Taino people, we're learning our language. So many people are learning the language. We're celebrating our culture through ceremony. We're celebrating Taino New Year. We are having aritos. We're drawing on our ancestral plant knowledge systems and developing good relationships and partnerships with other communities. And these are all examples of Taino social structures today, which are leading us into this new re-emergence of Taino peoplehood. In sharing also about Taino technology, Jackson, who is another person who identifies as Taino, provides insight into the role of oral history in transmitting these generational teachings among Taino people. He states, you know, these stories that have been passed down, it's coming from years, hundreds of years right down. If we look at even fishermen's trap that we use for fish and lobster, it was from the Taino. They make these traps and they could catch a lot of fish. So we come from a great technology that was passed down from these people, and it continues to survive because the technology that we have today now, it is from the original foundation that was laid by those Taino people. And then, you know, something about the Tainos, they were great navigators. They knew how to navigate themselves before the technology of compass and GPS. Another Jamaican Taino shared the following: we're still Taino in many ways. We enjoy some of the culture. Jamaica still have Taino people here. Our proof is our story and oral tradition. Taino has one of the greatest medicine wisdoms in the world. People need to have a voice. I collect art because of my own bloodline. People come to ask me about Taino. You can't get rid of Taino. They have a lot of love. Everywhere we should have a Taino Thanksgiving. So for Taino people, the memories of their ancestors are always present. We carry the memories in our blood, and they're passed through the generations. Harkin writes that our bodies are also archives that store our memories, and our bodies store our lived experiences, which are etched and anchored in our bloodlines deep. So through sharing, they have shown the many ways in which Taino activism, Taino self-determination is enactive and is alive. In sharing their knowledge, what you see is this continued presence and the contributions of Taino people. The stories reveal not just Taino of the past. As such, our walk or talk, whether we're sitting down, listening, sharing stories, this is what some scholars refer to as knowledge production in practice. A self-identified non-Taino person noted, there is great respect for the Taino ancestry in this area, which I think is because of the generational stories that have been told. And there are so many people that identify, and there are so many stories that are coming forward. And in speaking about Taino ancestry and connections, he further asserts, when something awakens inside is something real. You know, every person inside of this community, they have a history of the Tainos, and no Tainos are still alive. So you have this idea from listening to the folks that share their knowledge that Taino is fully alive. More and more people are identifying today. More and more people are having dialogue. Conversations are happening. More and more schools from kindergarten to post-secondary are interested in learning about the history, the culture, retention of Taino ways within Jamaica. Taino people are learning about Taino people. In fact, I believe the school system in Jamaica and other institutions there and at the grassroots level, broadly speaking, have done a remarkable job in rethinking about history and contemporary Taino presence. You have authors writing books. People are having this educational journey and understanding. We are celebrating the rainy seasons. We're celebrating the dry seasons. So now you have a lot of people on an individual level in Jamaica. You also see, I should say, in the diaspora as well. And you have a lot of people on a collective level. Again, I want to, in thinking about this, honor the Yamea Guani Taino people and the work that they're doing to tell these stories. And I also want to thank those Jamaican people who are interested and those who take the time to listen, because being able to talk about Taino openly today and having people willing to listen is a form of recognition. It is a form of self-determination. So in closing, in writing about the erasure of Taino people, I also write and talk about Taino people's agency, because in the present time, I can say with confidence that Taino people have surely transcended the usual everyday stories of their non-existence. And I came across this really great quote that I'd like to share with you. I had reached out to them on the Indigenous Taino people's Facebook page from back in 2017, and they said, yeah, you can use this quote anytime. So I have their permission. And I like it because I think it reflects Taino activism, it reflects Taino voice and Taino agency. So here it is. Taino Indigenous activism takes place at different places simultaneously around the world. It doesn't look the same at every place. It doesn't sound the same at every location. And the colors may be different based on geographical location. Yet the message remains the same all over the planet. And that message clearly, consistently, and relentlessly says the Extinction Project failed. Tainos survived, and we are writing ourselves right back into the history books. No Taino-related activism is too small or too insignificant. Everything counts during this historical time of resurgence. The next 7 generations will thank us for it. So on that note, I'd like to express my gratitude to the conference organizers, and I thank you for the work that you're doing to bring this into people's consciousness and into their hearts and into their minds. So thank you to everyone for listening, and ha-home.
Thank you so much, Erica, for this very engaging presentation on Taino activism, agency, and continuity, and most importantly, the Extinction Project failed. Brilliant work, and we look forward to continuing to engage with your work. Much thanks to you. Our second presenter is Mario Nisbet. He was educated at the University of the Virgin Islands, where he secured a Bachelor of Arts, and at Morgan State University, where he secured an MA. Of course, he also has another MA and PhD from University of California, Berkeley. He's currently a lecturer at the University of Cape Coast, Ghana, and he has work experiences in varying capacities within universities in Ghana, Jamaica, Kenya, and the United States. As an interdisciplinary scholar, he teaches, he researches, and of course, he writes in areas of African and African diaspora histories, diaspora studies theory, Pan-Africanism, slavery, and resistance. And his research interests includes this interdisciplinarity, development and post-development studies, along with Africana political thought. I want to welcome Dr. Mario Nisbet, who will present on the Jamaican Maroons and their claims to sovereignty. Welcome, Mario. Unmute, Mario.
Thank you for the warm introduction, and I'd like to also thank all the organizers that worked to make this presentation possible. So I'll jump straight into it, issues of Jamaican Maroons and the claim to sovereignty. So Maroons situate themselves as sovereign communities that struggle against colonial and post-colonial Jamaican state. Their claims to sovereignty are rooted in both pre-colonial and current notions of sovereign, indigenous, and African statehood and self-determination, challenging European ideas of Black objection and the Hobbesian state of nature, focusing on Africans rather than the indigenous roots, though the two are not mutually exclusive. This paper would explore how the Maroon communities are able to make certain social, political claims and territorial space. The Maroons see themselves as sovereign states. The founding of the state is traced back to its origin in Africa, a claim constantly reiterated by the general population, particularly in Akampong and among their leaders. In Maroon oral tradition, the African chieftaincy or kingdom type of governance system was established by the Maroons during the founding of their communities in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. For the Maroons, particular Akampong Maroons, the Treaty of 1739 with the British authorities are viewed as formal recognitions of Maroon sovereignty. It is important to note that Maroons' interpretation of the treaty agreement from an African's perspective challenged the British one. It has been traditionally thought that the treaty should be understood essentially through the written document of the British. However, we have to consider the Maroons' perspective. We have to recognize that the treaties were achieved through both written agreements and oath-taking agreements made through a blood ritual. Here we will focus on the written treaty, which has been privileged in official versions of this history. The written treaty are a form of documentary practice that has sought to silence oral tradition, notably shape popular understanding of the Maroon history and culture, and significantly affect their relations with the state. We have to recognize that the treaty was, they formed the most, so let me take it again, understanding of Maroon. So notably these ideas of the treaty impacted popular understanding of Maroon communities and how their view on the relationship with the state. They form the most exclusive basis for the judicial and authorial claims by the colonial and the post-colonial state. Even considering the written treaty, the British and the Maroons have different interpretations. From the British viewpoint, the treaty was a means of containing rebels who agreed to become a special class of subject in the colony of Jamaica. In contrast, the Maroons viewed the written treaty as an altered and problematic version of the blood treaty agreement. Hence, for the Maroon, the written treaty were essentially agreements between groups who recognize each other's sovereignty and wish to assist each other. Over the last 2 centuries, Scholars interpreting and debating the language of the written treaty have concluded that the treaty circumscribed Maroons' right to full autonomy and autonomous freedom. The Akankapong Maroons see their treaty with the British as a blood treaty that is both similar and different from the widely published and unilaterally amended written treaty. The blood treaty, presented in the form of oral history, raises issues of conflicting claim about autonomy, sovereignty, and self-governance. They are the root of the challenge to legality, constitutionality, and authority of the colonial and post-colonial state, relating to African claims to legitimacy versus European claims to roots in written documentation. For the present-day Maroons, the treaty essentially was acknowledging the Maroons as sovereign nations, with the nations giving each other mutual assistance. Maroon usually discuss the essence of the blood treaty, but not often the specifics. From the Maroons' perspective, the support they give and receive from the British and the government of Jamaica doesn't nullify their independence. The main representative body of all Maroons is the Maroon Council. For centuries, the shape of the governing council and its member varied from one chief or colonel to the next chief or colonel. In many ways, it currently resembles African indigenous governing system. Officials tend to number between several to about 30 members with at times different divisions, committee, and subcommittee. Additionally, the Akampong Maroons have election since the 1950s every 5 years, and they have their own constitution and flag. The land has been the locus of struggle over sovereignty since the beginning. Maroon view the land as belonging to the entire community, which include the ancestors, our past spirits, the born, those who are living members of the community, that could be located not only in the settlement itself, but in different parts of Jamaica and different parts of the globe. And the other member of the community is also seen as the unborn, or the descendants of the Maroon communities. The Maroon believe that the land tenure system and the chieftaincy system rule and the chief rule in the system directly came from African ancestors. Claims to territory and authority over it are based on African practices against colonial and post-colonial assertion of authority. This is materially grounded in ancestral communal land ownership. The issue is not so much the condition and terms and facility of sovereignty, but its signification. Over the centuries, the Maroons have had to struggle to continue to have communally owned land. The land ownership pattern is a challenge to the state and prevailing Western thoughts and land ownership and distribution arrangements. In many respects, control over land is the material condition upon which sovereignty claims are based. Hence, the power to tax or enforce tax regimes have become one significant element of sovereign authority. What is important here is Maroons' authority over land is linked to sovereignty. There is no sovereignty without control of territory. This is what a state is. There are apparatus and technology that legitimize exclusive control over people and territory. The settlements are the stronghold of sovereignty for the Maroon, the land they won from the British. The written treaty acknowledged Maroon ownership of land, but it limits the territorial size to a few thousand acres. The blood treaty made through a treaty signing methods embraced the blood treaty made through a treaty signing method embraced as African is used to argue the two sides of the Maroon lands. Control of and authority over land is used as the material condition of sovereignty. All states make that claim and ultimately the right to use the land. But the difference here is that in which authority is used and normalized. For the West, it's based on documentary practice of constitutionality. For the Maroon, it is African-derived practice of the blood treaty and its associated orality. The Accompon Maroon claim control over a sizable portion of western section of the island of Jamaica. It is critical practice both in utterance and act that claim is sustained. At different times and from different peoples, there are differences in views regarding the exact size and contour of the land. The Accompon Maroons, supported by many elders, claim not only the territory of 100 and 1,500 and 3,000 acres of land of Accompon, but also large section of Western Jamaica, including the cockpit country. The issue here is legitimacy of the blood treaty that dictates the territorial size and location. In the last 3 centuries, Maroon and British have been in a struggle over control of territory. There is no record of Accompon having more than 15 or 3,000 acres of land in the British or Jamaican archives. However, Accompon Maroon have historically believed that they were not given, but they won a much larger territory than they have at present. There are numerous British archival documents, newspapers account showing Maroons claiming land outside of that claimed territory that is often in official documents, where Maroons would be claiming land in Westmoreland, in St. James Parish, different parts of St. Elizabeth, from since the signing of the treaty. So at least in the Maroon consciousness, and the British documents have shown that the Maroons have had a long tradition of believing that they own larger territory, which is substantiated by oral tradition. The Maroon view of land highlights the symbolic significance of control over territory. The struggle is to maintain control over territory against the incursion of the Jamaican state. It is also over the term of such control. Sovereign control are a form of constrained autonomy subject to the exercise of the state power. Informed by their own understanding of their ancestors, the Maroons have ideas and vision of harmonious with the typical use of environmental space. The Maroon believe that the community and the surrounding area, especially the Catholic country, should be protected and preserved in the line of their African ancestral views. However, the Jamaican government does not recognize Maroon sovereignty, although it used Maroon history in creating the narrative of Jamaican statehood. The post-colonial Jamaican state embraced the narrative of Maroon as being the first freedom fighters and forerunners of Jamaican nationhood. In this nationhood that Maroons are part of but not sovereign from. Maroon communities are entangled with a variety of apparatus of the state, including educational institution, cultural institution, environmental, community development office, and as such. Hence, the Jamaican state actively inscribes Maroon into the space of the state. However, there are also the symbolic significance of sovereignty claims. For the Maroons, as discussed above, the issue is how the conflicts ensue are dealt with and negotiated. The state cannot fully undermine the legitimacy of sovereign claims without attacking Jamaican state's own claim about the beginning of Jamaican nationhood, and the Maroons cannot escape the entanglement with the state. The Jamaican states need the Maroon to sustain their narrative of nationhood and make it so that the two are entangled in each other's existence. This is the dilemma. Maroon critically practice of sovereignty is pitted against the reality of their entanglement with a modern Jamaican state. Maroon believes that possessing the still binding blood treaty and having a unique history make it possible for them to continue to claim sovereignty, if not in its full realization. They want to preserve the material condition upon which these claims are made, such as authority over land. In claiming sovereignty, Jamaican Maroons envision a type of state and political order. It is an attempt to separate from sovereignties of post-colonial and new colonial states that are still under Western domination. It is separation from an unsustainable developmentalist global order that is increasingly leading to humans' inability to live on the planet. In concluding, it is a renewal desire to center freedom as a core societal value. It is a vision of and living in communally held land. It is the value of harmonious relation with environmental space. It is an aspiration to make the ancestors a living and the future generation active member of the nation. It is a globe of mobile population that encourage diasporic and transnational network and linkages. It is interdependence between states without hegemonic outcomes. It is a world that recognizes the full humanity of the Maroon and African. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario, for this very thought-provoking presentation on the language of Maroon sovereignty as ratified within the Blood Treaty and its implications for Maroon claims to ancestral land, statehood, self-determination, and of course, complexities of nationhood within the post-colonial 21st Jamaica. Thank you very much for this presentation, Mario. And now we have our last, but certainly not least, presenter, Dr. Leslie Gale Atkinson Swaby, who of course is a graduate of the UWI, Mona, the University of Glasgow, the University of Florida, where she obtained a BA in History and Archaeology, an MPhil in Archaeological Studies, and of course, a PhD in Anthropology, respectively. She has over 15 years experience as an archaeologist, a cultural resource manager, a researcher, an educator, and of course, an editor. As an educator, she has taught at both the postgraduate and undergraduate levels in archaeology, heritage, art history, and research methodology. She is well published, and one of her latest publications is a work called Yamaye, Jamaican Prehistory and Contact Period, Current Research and Challenges in the Journal of Caribbean Archaeology. But today, her paper is entitled Exploring the Concept of Indigeneity within the Jamaican Context. Leslie Gale Atkinson Swaby, welcome.
Good day. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I have a PowerPoint presentation. Please let me know as soon as you can see the screen.
We can see the screen.
Okay. All right. So let us start first with, a simple concept definition of indigeneity and indigenous. And at a basic level, indigeneity is the fact that you have populations that occur naturally or originated in a particular place, and it essentially underlines the notion of what it means to be indigenous. I know indigenous, whether from a biological perspective or anthropological perspective, refers to biological species that originated naturally in a specific area or region. So I'm going to have some fun showcasing some biological examples. And in biology, in terms of zoology and botany, when we think about these species, we think about categories such as endemic or native, indigenous, introduced, exotic, or invasive species. So endemic is basically a plant or animal that is only found in a particular area and nowhere else in the world. Indigenous is viewed as a type of native species, but it is not necessarily confined to one area. It is generally more widely dispersed and also viewed to be more widely adaptable. And then we have those that are categorized as introduced, which, as the name suggests, it is a species that is not native to a particular area and that it has been introduced whether deliberately or accidentally. And there are a lot of accidental introductions in the region. All right, so in looking at an example, here we have the black-billed streamer-tailed hummingbird, and it's endemic to Jamaica, but it is not only just endemic to the country of Jamaica. Endemism can also be particular parts of an area. So this type of hummingbird is only found in eastern Jamaica. So it's found nowhere else in the world but in eastern Jamaica. And then when we look at indigenous, we can look at the sea grape, which is primarily found in the West Indies and in the Americas, in places like the Bahamas, in the Caribbean, in Central and Northern South America, and places like Florida. I don't know how many of you have ever tried a ripened sea grape, but it actually almost tastes like grape. It's pretty good. So not the green one. You should definitely try the purple fruit. So that is an example of something that is indigenous, a plant species. And then we have an example of an introduced animal, which is the black rat, which
One second, Leslie. We're not seeing the slides move. And
where are you seeing?
We're seeing the design view. We're not seeing the full slideshow view.
All right, let me try again.
It's moving now, Leslie.
Okay, what are you seeing now?
You're seeing
Still seeing the design
animals.
view. Still
Which
seeing
one?
the design view though.
All right, can I just go enlarge in the design view? Because this looks like it's going to be problematic.
Yeah, sure. As long as you advance the slides so we can keep up.
All right, so what are you seeing now?
We're seeing the endemic animals. Like.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is the black-billed streamer-tailed hummingbird that I was saying that is endemic to not only Jamaica, but in terms of eastern Jamaica. Only place in the world it is found. And this is the sea grape, if you're not familiar, that I was talking about, which is indigenous to the West Indies, particularly the Caribbean, the Bahamas, Northern South America, Central America, and Florida. And this is where I was at, the black rat, which was introduced, but not deliberately, quite by accident. It is native to the Indian subcontinent, and it came with the Spaniards because our indigenous rodents did not include the black rat. It included things like the rice rat, which unfortunately is now extinct. All right, now in terms of from an anthropological perspective, indigeneity is a lot more complicated. And when you think about issues like origin or origination in terms of creation, you're going to go really back far in prehistory and look at things like human evolution, the possible ancestry of the Homo erectus for the Homo sapiens and the Homo sapiens sapiens, which is what we are, modern humans. And of course, the prevailing theories that exist, such as the out of Africa theory and the multi-regional evolutionary theory. Now, we're not doing a class in human evolution, but if you're talking about actual origin of the human species, well, then we really have to go back to Africa. But in terms of indigenous studies, it is heavily tied to the earliest settlers to a particular region, First Nations. And in terms of the Americas, we know based on archaeological evidence that North and South America was populated between 12,000 to 15,000. More recently, it has even gone as far as 20,000 years ago. And then the Caribbean was populated a little later, between 5,000 and 8,000 years ago by populations from possibly the North, Central, and South America. All right. In terms of embracing indigeneity, in the Caribbean, we have to think about, not just as a place of origin, not just as ties, but who evolved here, who was created here. And if we look at Benjamin Irving Rose, he was an archaeologist, and he is actually the major model. It's still that is still recognized. I mean, there's been a lot of challenges of late, but it is still recognized. He talks about the Austenites, which is a culture that evolved in the region as a result of interactions between the various migrants from Central and South America in the Caribbean. And the Austenites were said to be the population that colonized places like Jamaica and the Bahamas from about the 7th century onwards, and they are viewed as the ancestors of the Taino. Now, we use the term Taino very loosely, and especially when we're dealing with prehistoric cultures. And in Jamaica, we assume that all prehistoric sites are Taino sites, and that's not necessarily the case. In the Jamaican context, we have what is known as the Austenian, which dates back to the 7th century, the first colonizers, and then you had a later group called the Mayakans, or what we know as the White Mile style. The White Mile is a famous site in St. Catherine, which is one of our most dominant prehistoric sites. And then we have a culture that evolved in Jamaica, which is known as the Fairfield Complex or the Montego Bay style. And then we have what we consider the Taino. And the Taino is a result of years of interaction between various groups within the specific context within the Greater Antilles and some areas in the Lesser Antilles. And usually when you think about the starting point, it's kind of difficult when you're studying cultures for exact starting point. We're thinking about from 1200 CE up to contact and after. All right, so the concept of indigeneity is heavily tied to pre-colonial cultures. And this is something that is not unique to the region, but it is something that has been experienced across the globe. So this is just an example of the pottery, because, what has remained largely are things like inorganic materials like pottery and stone tools. So this is an example of redware or Austenian pottery. This is an example of decorative styles and a pot associated with the Jamaican Mayak or White Mile people. This is an example of the decorative style of the Montego Bay or Fairfield Complex. And this is this type of material culture is what we generally associate with the Tainos. These are two semis from Carpenter's Mountain, which is in Manchester, that are now in the collection of the British Museum. And we have here the Birdman, that's the nickname for it, which dates the wood and dates to the 11th to 12th centuries, and the resin dates to the 17th century. So the date ranges anywhere between these 2 points. And then Boyanel, because whether this is really a true representation of the rain deity is still up in question. But this semi is dated between the 13th and the 15th centuries. Now, let us look at some of the challenges embracing indigeneity. But first, let us start with a little context in terms of who are recognized as indigenous peoples. And sadly, indigenous peoples represent only 5% of the global population. That's like an estimate of about 370 million across the globe. They spread across over 5,000 indigenous cultures. They speak over 4,000 indigenous languages, and they're found in over 90 countries, and about 50% are found in Asia. It is estimated that about over 50 million are found in the Americas. Now, according to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, important characteristics include the presence in an area before the formation of modern state borders, right? Maintenance, whether wholly or partially, their own social, economic, cultural, and political institutions. continuance of cultural traditions and practices, genetics or DNA, and of course, rights to their traditional residential places and natural resources. Indigenous peoples are largely isolated or marginalized populations, many of which have been forced from their ancestral lands, denied the opportunity to express their culture, physical attacks and treatments as second-class citizens. And with the arrival of the Europeans in the 15th century, this resulted in the abuse, demise, and displacement of many indigenous populations in the Americas. Studies range between 50 to 95% in terms of the estimation of the demise. I know that we are not Latin America, but I brought this here because racial depictions in the British Caribbean totally ignore the presence of indigenous peoples, but the Latin American context does acknowledge the indigenous peoples, and they are actually at the bottom of the social ladder. They're either, it depends on the reference that you're using. In some cases, they're beneath the Africans. In other cases, they're above the enslaved Africans. So this is a casta painting, or English version cast painting, which is very popular in the 18th century. And it basically highlights the 16 racial groupings. Now, I don't agree. I'm not comfortable with these categories, but my feelings about this doesn't change the fact that the system existed and the legacy of it still exists today, right? And in terms of mixture, interracial unions between the indigenous people and like the Europeans and the Africans, we have offspring which are labeled as mestizos, which is what is depicted in this image here, of a Spaniard and an Indian, right? And then we have what is known as a Zambo or Sambo, and this is of an African and an indigenous person. And some of these racial classification systems still exist in Latin American countries. And actually, about 10 years ago, I was at a Smithsonian workshop and I met a gentleman of African descent from the Dominican Republic. He had a Taino first name and a Spanish last name. And he told me that he was Sambo. And when he said that, I was so shocked, I almost fell off my chair. And I just found it particularly heartbreaking, but we come from a different context, but these realities still exist. Now, there are several issues or challenges that I find or have experienced that have affected our ability as a nation and as a people in embracing indigeneity. One is the persistent narrative of the myth of extinction, and Erica in her presentation touched on this. Also, the need for more documentation of oral interviews of people who claim indigenous ancestry. One is a general disregard that I find for people to respect people's choice in terms of how they choose to self-identify and self-determination. And of course, the lack of support in terms of state structures and agencies for indigenous populations. And what I call the cafeteria mentality, in which we were very, very selective about which indigenous elements that we choose to embrace. Now, the myth of extinction. Total extermination from an anthropological perspective is very, very rare. Pockets of threatened groups, do survive, whether in terms of biological legacies, cultural legacies. I mean, when you look at contemporary examples of attempts of genocide, like the Armenians by the Ottoman Empire, or the Roma people in World War II, or the Tutsis in the 90s, I'm by no means condoning, no meaning minimizing the horrors of these experiences, but gladly, some of these populations did survive. So in reality, it is very, very difficult for there to be true extinction. But the other issue is, how do we determine extinction? Is it by the numbers? But then in the case of the pre-colonial and contact period in the Caribbean, do we even know realistically what the population estimates are? Can we rely on characters like Las Casas? No, because contemporary studies have argued that those populations have been overestimated. It doesn't, again, demise the fact that, the fact that, you know, masses and masses of indigenous people across the region were killed, whether by deliberate practices or not. But there've always been rumors, you know, in the Jamaican context of what we call Arawak escapees who took refuge in the interior, like the Blue Mountains, the Dry Harbor Mountains, and pockets like St. Elizabeth, right? Is extinction the absence of cultural or biological traits? What does an indigenous person or their descendant look like? And in a region where it is comprises of a lot of people who are multiracial, you know, how do you then say that this person is not who they claim they are? So in looking at like their presence in the era before modern state borders, this is a distribution of Jamaican prehistoric sites. And this is only 409 sites. I mean, there's at least another 200 more that I have not been able to plot. This shows you that Jamaica is tiny in a country. I mean, these concepts of indigenous people only settling on the coast is nonsense. They penetrated most areas of the island, right? In looking at also at the Maroon settlements in isolated areas like the Cockpit Country and the Blue Mountains and so forth, these were viewed as prime areas for the Maroon communities, right? And when you look at Jamaica's nomination, which was eventually successful on the UNESCO World Heritage Site, Blue and Jonquil Mountains, even though, you know, the island has quite a range in terms of biodiversity and, you know, and natural heritage where the Blue and Jonquil Mountains is concerned, the cultural heritage component was and the Maroon ties to the Blue and Jonquil Mountains was a very, very important element in the success of the nomination to becoming a mixed site, right? In terms of cultural, Mario in his presentation highlighted some of the political systems associated with the Maroons, the fact of their Maroon Council or Secretariat, you know, these communities that they have their systems of governance, which are, you know, they have their elections, which I understand are overseen by the Electoral Office. I find that interesting. But in terms of cultural legacies, our first inscription ever on a UNESCO platform was the Maroon Heritage of Moortown. And that was back in 2008. So, you know, how do we pick and choose what to embrace? In terms of legacies that exist still, we have things like, you know, the thatch roof. This image here is actually Blenheim, Bustamante's birthplace. These are some thatch houses in Akompong that I took many years ago on a Kojo Day celebration. We have cultural retention, such as the issue of jerk. Is it jerk or is it barbacoa? The Maroon said jerk, but it is very similar to the timing of barbacoa. In terms of our technology, such as, you know, creating dugout canoas. This is a silk cotton tree, Seba. Seba is Taino. This is actually a picture I took in Black River showing a traditional dugout boat. That's pretty cool. And this is a fisherman in Black River, right? When you look at our farming systems, Kanuku, mound farming, slash and burn, terracing, you know, these traditions are all indigenous. This is a fish pot. This is actually, we still use these. This is kasibe, which we call bami. This is buso. Now, if you ever go to Moortown, make sure you get some buso soup, really nice. You know, but these are the buso is a snail that the indigenous people consumed, right? How are these indigenous cultural practices transmitted to successive generations? By whom? And are these legacies distinct from the dominant population? In looking at genetics, we have the work of people like Dr. Jaden Ben-Torres, who worked on the Maroons, which highlighted the presence of Indigenous American DNA in the maternal line, and that ranged from 2 to 72%. This is one of her papers with Harcourt Miller talking about that experience. And the ASJ last year had a seminar in which she talked about that experience. So maybe you could get a link to see that. But in terms of popular genographic kits like Geno 2.0, Ancestry, DNA, 23andMe, You find increasingly more and more Jamaicans have done these tests, and they get samples. From my personal experience in terms of encounter, they have gotten results of 2 to 7% Indigenous Americans. That would imply that maybe a great-grandparent or great-great-great-grandparent was possibly Indigenous. Diane Frankinson Golden, who's a popular genealogist, has even told me of encounters with people who have claimed 25% Indigenous American ancestry. That would imply a grandparent that would have Indigenous ties. You know, now I'm not saying to you for you to purchase a genographic kit, but I'm just saying that, you know, these are, you know, facilities that are available to you. But then the issue is, regardless of the percentage, even if it's 3% or 1 in 32, a person still has a right to determine how they choose to self-identify, right? And this is an example of Elizabeth Warren. She's a US Senator, and she claimed to be Cherokee. You know, she looks like a typical Caucasian white woman, and she claimed that she was Cherokee, and she identified legally as Cherokee and as a minority, right? And, you know, people were in a huff about it because her grandmother told her she was of Cherokee lineage. How are we going to deny how somebody, what their family history has told them about who they are? These oral traditions are the backbone of how Indigenous cultures survive, but we consider them only when it is convenient. This is a painting by Osmond Watson, Afro-Wak Madonna, and this is my favorite painting. And I think this embodies me because I'm a phenotypically Black woman, and I get a lot of pushback because I identify as Indigenous, and I've made my career studying Indigenous. But why are you only one thing? You know, many of us are multiracial. Even, this is just for humor though, but this is Sir Alexander Bustamante. And he said he was 25% Irish, 25% English, 25% German, 25% Arawak, and 25% African. No, if you're good at math, you do that's 125%. But he said that the 125 meant that he was 25% better than any other man. But it is not but it is something that I have heard, that Bustamante has always claimed that his grandmother was an Arawak. This is Mr. Campbell from Pedro Bluff in St. Elizabeth. This photo is dated to the 1890s because people think that this claim for indigeneity is something that is new. It's not new, you know, and there are accounts from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century of people, especially in the Pedro area in St. Elizabeth, who claimed that they are not East Indian, that they are Arawak, you know, or in what we know now as Indigenous Taino ancestry. I don't know if Erica remembers this picture, but all the women in this photograph identify as Indigenous. Tai Pelair, this is Miss Olive, Erica's mom, Erica, Dan Frankinson Golden, Brooke, and myself. My Taino name is Boyanani, and it means sweet water flower. And in Indigenous circles, nobody knows me as Leslie Gale Atkinson. All right, and Erica in her presentation highlighted Cacique Nibonwish Kaiman, and this is his installation in 2009 at Charlestown, and I'm very happy that I was there for it. There's another cacique, I don't remember Jenna's Taino name, Jenna Gregory Archer with the Taino Heritage Group in St. Mary, who is recognized as a cacique also, all right? But my final thing is our coat of arms depicts Indigenous elements like the saltwater crocodile, the Taino man and the Taino woman, the pineapple, Anana. Anana is Taino for pineapple, right? And even though a lot of people question the appropriateness of using the Taino on the coat of arms, the fact of the matter is it still hasn't been changed. We have changed the meaning of Black on our flag, so it is not a matter that we can't change it, right? But I haven't seen to date any petition of people changing the coat of arms. Is it only in nostalgia that we recognize these people? Is it a desire to link, or is this a perception of these people as being lost? But based on our intangible cultural heritage, the Taino are not lost. The Taino is still living. It is still a part of us. All right. Thank you, Hahom. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erica, for this very thought-provoking presentation. We thoroughly enjoyed it, and you allowed us to embrace indigeneity through so many different ways, through materiality, through myths, through absence, and to think about retentions, the cuisine, the jerk, the agricultural systems, but also deeper questions of continuity, including who transmitted, these genealogies of indigeneity to the local community, how we recognize and embrace indigeneity through our coat of arms and so on. Thank you so very much for this very brilliant and excellent presentation. So, audience, we have been fed, by this brilliant scholarship from our panelists, and let us thank our panelists for such excellent presentations, from Taino activism and agency to the Maroon claims to ancestral lands, within how they define community land, and the implications for nationhood, to how we embrace indigeneity through materiality, Taino materiality located in museums, that there is so much marginalization, there is so much complexity and nuance there when it comes to how we embrace this indigeneity and sovereignty. So, audience, I want to welcome you to the Q&A section, where you will be able to ask your questions, to make your comments, to reason with the panelists. We want to say to you that you can, of course, share your questions, your comments over the microphone by using the raise the hand function, so that we can be notified. Your questions can be addressed widely to all of the panelists, or they can be specifically addressed to a specific presentation. So welcome, audience, to the Q&A. So I'm guessing that we're all thinking about all of these brilliant presentations. There are, of course, similar themes that we saw across the presentations. And I think one in particular was the theme of extraction, how to think about indigenous identity and the ways that we can extract Taino and Maroon histories, heritage, memories in the Caribbean. So I have a question. Of course, I have many questions, and because the panelists raised such thought-provoking conversations, right? And ways in which we can think. So one of the questions that I have, of course, would be, let me see the first one. The first question I'll probably want to ask is, how do you think, panelists, this is for all of you, we can regenerate indigenous narratives from the local community? What more can we do to fill the absence within our Caribbean stories, in particular, what is taught in our schools, and of course, what is not taught? We know that there is so much absence, that the indigenous memories, the memories of the Maroon communities are often silent. So the question is, how do we regenerate that? What do you say to our governments in terms of policy? How do we revive indigeneity and Maroon sovereignty within our local communities? And then we can take a question from Judith. So, Erica?
Okay, let me get my mute button off. So how do we regenerate indigenous? I honestly think that we're doing that. And this conference and this panel reinforced the fact that these things are being done. We have so many things that are happening. You couldn't have this conversation 10 years ago.
Mhm.
5 years ago, you couldn't either. So regeneration is happening in the schools. You have children orators today, where Taino kids are celebrating their culture, they're dancing, they're learning the songs. Everybody is working on something and it's coming together to make the whole. So I think that we're doing that. We're doing that. People are doing that. A lot of Jamaicans are listening. They want to hear more. That has been my experience for the past 10 years. In her presentation, Dr. Gail talked about the importance of hearing people's voices, people who identify as Taino, and bringing that into contemporary context. That is happening. That's one of the focus of my work, is on Indigenous people in Jamaica or the diaspora, people who are Jamaican who say they're Taino or they're Indigenous. So I honestly think we're doing that. We're doing it bit by bit. We're doing it bit by bit. And I do believe that the government is listening, but it's all about timing. Nothing happens before it's time. 10 years ago, I couldn't say I was Taino. In some parts, depending on where I'm at, I still can't say I'm Taino. I have to choose the right space to say I'm Taino. So it's all a matter of time, and things are happening.
Thank you very much, Erica. Mario, how do we regenerate Maroon sovereignty within our local communities?
So, I mean, I would agree with other presenters in terms of more information is coming out about knowledge about Indigenous people, about the Maroons. And I think recently, especially, so Maroons have been talking about sovereignty for a very long time, but it's a lot of people think recently now, because of Chief Curry in Akampong that out of nowhere Maroons started to say they're sovereign. But if you go back in the literature, for even going back into that deep colonial period in the 18th century, Maroons were saying they were a state. And if you look at the literature, even going back, you see Maroons have been saying this for a very long time. So I think that the conversation has been opened up, especially recently with the debate between Holness and Chief Curry. And I think people are interested in having that conversation. And I think having that conversation would bring out more information and more knowledge about the Maroons generally.
Excellent, Mario. Thank you very much for your answer. And Leslie, there is a comment for you. I look forward to seeing the national discussion on these questions evolved from your presentation. How do we regenerate Indigenous narratives from the local community?
Well, I think the first thing is respect and to take people seriously. I mean, Erica made that point. I don't know if she knows this, but in 2014, when she did her presentation, there was a newspaper article stating that I am not extinct, and it talked about, her making that statement, and it was, I don't know, but for me, I found it very emotional, and it wasn't me, But there was pushback, there was negativity. People were talking about what we have been taught. People don't seem to realize that your history is based on the current data at the time, and data constantly evolves, it constantly improves, it is constantly there to expand our knowledge. And people disregard Indigenous identity and Maroon identity because they probably don't realize that they have it within them, because you don't know. Even within my own family, I didn't know that we were, descendants of Maroons. And that is because my grandmother took the stance that, the Maroons were traitors, and that is a popular narrative. But my argument to people who say that, how come we're angry about the Europeans for enslaving us and taking us from Africa, but we're not angry at the Africans who profited from slavery? Because they did. How we pick and choose, So I think we need to know who we are, and definitely more studies need to be done to showcase, our links to these groups, and maybe then people will connect, because there's clearly a disconnect.
Thank you very much, Leslie. So we have two questions, one from Judith Byfield and the other from Daniel Livesey. So we'll have Judith first because we saw your hand first. Judith, you may go ahead with your question or your comment. Is Judith still with us? Judith, are you here? Okay, so while we're waiting on Judith, Danielle, Danielle, are you still with us?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
We're hearing you clearly. Thank you, Danielle.
Great. So much. I really enjoyed this panel. I learned a lot, and it was really inspiring to just hear about what's going on in the Taino community and the Maroon community right now. And I was just curious if the panelists could talk a little bit more about not just the aspect of recovery, but also maybe invention. I don't know if that's the right word. I'll just use an example for where I live. I live in Southern California in the United States, on the ancestral lands of the Tongva people. And a lot of their language was lost. And part of the process over the last 40 or 50 years is not just recovering the old elements of the language, but inventing new words to try to create a working language that all people can use. And so it's sort of that rediscovery of an identity which was suppressed for so long, either of outside forces suppressing it, from inside forces suppressing it, has sort of been deconstructed a little bit.
It's
sorry.
more a comment. And first, I just want to say, I thank everybody on this panel.
Okay.
Yes, sorry about that.
Yes.
I thought I had unmuted, but I hadn't.
Oh, you were muted. Okay. We can just one more minute, and then we can certainly take your question and comment because Daniel had started. So we're just gonna take it in about a few minutes, right? That's fine. Thank you. Yes, Daniel. Your
Sure.
comment.
Yeah. Sorry. I'll just wrap it up to say that I'm just curious if the panelists could speak to the process of not just cultural recovery, but creating sort of new elements of Indigenous culture, just as a sort of needing reaction to the effects of colonization and genocide, and maybe the ways in which that's been really instrumental in helping that cultural recovery.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Very curious question. So we can have Erica can go. We can.
Okay, I mean, that's a great question. And that's something we talk about a lot in Taino circles. We are not just Taino of the past, but Taino of the present, contemporary today Taino that do our 9 to 5, go to a university, do this, do that, go send our kids to school. And I think that for any culture is not static. It changes over time. Taino people adapt and change over time. So for example, if there are words in our Taino language that we're trying to regenerate that wasn't there, that our ancestors had, we're finding new ways of expressing ourselves through the language today. And we have Taino linguists, indigenous linguists across the Caribbean who are working on the different Taino languages or dialects, because it's going to be different too. Taino peoples are very diverse. There's different dialects or, don't know a lot about the language. It's a learning thing for me as well. But I know that we're not necessarily recovering just the past. In doing so, we're also creating a new future, not just for the present, but as the quote said, which is very common theme among Indigenous people, thinking 7 generations ahead, so that when I'm gone, I'm going to be a good ancestor, and the kids that will be there will know who they are, and they don't have to go through what we went through. So yeah, I think we're not just recovering, but we're also we're adapting, and we are regenerating in the present as well. But I think that's a great question. Like any cultures, not just Taino, even if they never experienced genocide, cultures are not static, they're not frozen in time, and they adapt to the circumstances and situations in which they find themselves. So the language adapts too.
Thank you very much for your answer. Mario, in terms of Maroon sovereignty, how do we create working language? How do we invent, sovereign cultures around the Maroon communities? What do we do? How do we answer?
I mean, my experience in working with the Maroon communities, and I've learned a lot from the Maroon communities, but the communities are not static, as the earlier presenter just said. It's cultures are dynamic, and so you have situations. So part of my work, what I look at is also looking at what work is the connection to Africa, the connection to indigenous people is doing in those communities. What is it producing? And for the Maroon communities, they both trace, depending on the individual you speak to, because people have different views. Some would trace their ancestries going back to the African continent, while some would trace their ancestries going back to indigenous people of Jamaica. Some would do both. And what you see also too is that in Maroons making connection to, say for example, Africa, there is a drum that is called a Gombe drum in Maroon communities. And many Maroons that you speak to would tell you that the drums came from West Africa, probably from Ghana, from West Africa, but there have been recent research that actually show that that drum actually was created by the Maroons, and also it was actually exported to Africa by those Maroons that were sent back to Sierra Leone, and it actually spread throughout West Africa and spread towards Central Africa, where 15 countries in Africa and West Central Africa actually use some form of the drum, even though its origination actually came from the Maroons. But so, as the other speaker said, like sometimes, history, you learn new information and you learn new language, you learn new knowledge. So I think some of it might be creation, but it's creation out of a need of identifying with a particular past or a particular culture. And all cultures do that. Like there's no culture that doesn't do these sort of reinvention and reforming themselves. So Maroons have done that, and other cultures and other people, I argue, have done that too.
Thank you very much, Mario. You've raised further questions with your answer. Excellent. Let me hear from Leslie Gale. I know that you've spoken about this disregard for indigeneity. So how do we create? Are we inventing? Are we creating? Or is this continuity, which is really the crux of the question?
I mean, it's a bit of all. I mean, I don't mean that as a cop-out. Daniel, raised a very, very important part. Language is very critical in, with regards to culture and cultural survival. And the Taino language was viewed as a dead language, even though over 800 to 1,000 words had survived in ethnohistoric accounts. And I don't understand how it was categorized as a dead language, because when you look at the indigenous names of places in the region, the indigenous names of our plants and our animals, and even certain objects, they have retained their indigenous name. When you look at the name Jamaica, please don't tell me about Examica. All right, Jamaica, depending on the language, varies. Sometimes it starts with an I, sometimes starts with a J, sometimes an X, sometimes an H. Even the ending changes, the root changes. What doesn't change is the root, ama, A-M-A. Ama means river or water in Taino. I mean, when you think about Jamaica's, a land of wood and water, it is coming from, these geographical characteristics of the island that has been recognized by the indigenous people, and it has constantly evolved from, land of possibly many rivers to land abounding with springs to land of wood and water. But contemporary Taino have not only sought to preserve the language that has been recorded, but also to create new words and also to reject certain aspects in terms of how it was recorded. So if you notice in the image of Cacique's, Nibon Rich's installation, if you notice the spelling of Cacique is with a K rather than with a C. So I mean, all of these things, they may seem petty to some people, but it is a way of them taking back. And even there have been the creation of new words, slang phrases, like there's a Taino phrase called Seneca Kakona, which means abundant blessings. I mean, that is not from the ethnohistoric accounts. This is something that has been created in contemporary periods. And I think the base that they have used is the local language, which is the language of the Lokonos, which are the people that have been mistakenly called Arawak, because the Arawak is a language family, and even the ones that lived on the islands, they were referred to as Arawaks, but that was a mistake, these legacies are there, and their efforts to create new ways, of preserving and promoting the culture.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Are you all hearing me clearly?
Yes, we are.
Okay, Xavier, I needed some help. My screen went black. I'm not seeing anything. Are you seeing me?
Yeah, I'm seeing you and hearing you.
Okay, that works until we get to sort it out. Wonderful. So there was also a question from Judith. Judith?
Thinking that Judith might be experiencing a bit of delay, so she's not hearing us right now.
Okay.
Let's see if I can get through to her via the chat.
Okay. Judith, are you hearing us? Are you able to unmute?
Hi, Candia. This is Thera. Just wanted to relate something from the YouTube chat.
Okay.
Sylvia Coinwork said for Leslie Gale that she looks forward to seeing the national discussion on the questions raised in her presentation that would evolve on her presentation. And a note from Diane Brown thanking us for the broadcast via YouTube and the talk that she heard.
Thank you very much, Professor Cohenberg, the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education. And thank you very much, Diane, for the question and the comments that you have raised. Are we able to reach Judith? Anyone?
Yes.
Greetings, Judith. You may go ahead with your question or your comment.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
We're hearing you, Judith.
Okay. It was actually more of a comment,
Okay.
but I really just want to thank all the panelists for these really stimulating papers. I'm primarily an Africanist.
We've lost Judith.
Yeah.
Okay, Judith, you're back with us.
Yes, I'm unmuted.
Okay, excellent. The last thing we heard was Pan-Africanist.
She's hearing the delay, Candia.
Yes, she's experiencing the delay.
Let's move on because it's not
okay. Thank you. So we are. I just want to check to see if Judith is still with us or if that's it.
Yeah,
Judith?
you can proceed.
Okay. So this was such a stimulating and very thought-provoking panel, and I want to thank the panelists and of course the audience for taking the time to participate in this panel.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Hi.
Judith.
Can you hear me?
We're hearing you.
Okay, good.
We'll allow you to very quickly.
More a comment that, I really appreciated the papers. Good. I find that part of what's so inspiring about the papers are the way they put this question of indigeneity in Jamaica in broader conversation, not just with Central and Latin America and North America, for that matter too, but also Africa. Because I think in so many of these locations, indigeneity. Oh, okay. Yeah, that indigeneity is a political issue. Yeah, so it's indigeneity. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Judith. We certainly got your comments on how fascinating the presentations were, and of course the wider implications and the nuances of indigeneity and sovereignty. We thank you so much. We know of the all of the technical issues that we experienced, but we are so happy that we were able to have a very smooth flowing panel today, all day, and of course, now the third panel, the final panel for today. So let us, say thank you to our panelists, and thank you to the audience for taking the time to participate in the session, for your support of the Association of Caribbean Historians and Academics. And of course, we want to just remind you of that at the end of the session tomorrow, you can follow the Elsa Govaya Memorial Lecture from 5 p.m. on uetv.org. And on Wednesday, you can follow the panel on tourism entitled Tourism and Identity Construction in Post-Colonial Jamaica. And I feel as if there is a link, there is certainly a link within this panel on indigeneity and sovereignty in post-colonial Jamaica, and all the ways in which they're contested, but certainly the ways in which we can embrace the indigenous identities of our Neo-Indians, and of course the sovereignty of the Maroons in post-colonial Jamaica. And this has certainly resonance for indigeneity and sovereignty across the Caribbean. I thank all of you. You've been such an excellent and brilliant panel. And I thank all the participants and our audience on the YouTube live stream, and of course, those of you here with us via the Zoom. Take care, everyone. Peace and blessings to all of you. Walk good.